A few weeks ago, I published a video about how to make a sourdough starter from scratch. I'll link that in the description box for you if you missed it. But in that, I promised I'd share with you how the bread turned out with that starter. So today, I am baking bread with my very own homemade starter for the first time. And along the way, I'm also going to share with you some of the new bread stencils that I have made and will be adding to my site soon. I have made a lot of sourdough bread with established starters that I got from a friend or even some that I have purchased, but this is my first time baking sourdough bread with a new starter. To see how this compares with the bread that I usually make, I am using the exact same easy no-knead sourdough bread recipe. For this, I use 750 grams of all-purpose flour, 200 grams of whole wheat flour, 200 grams of active bubbly starter, 650 grams of water, and 20 grams of coarse kosher salt. That simple list of ingredients is why I love making sourdough bread and why I encourage others to make sourdough bread too, because they are clean, simple ingredients. It is literally flour, water, salt, and starter. And starter is just flour and water. That's it. So it's really an empowering way to make something in the kitchen, to feed your family, and to get creative. And for me, it brings a lot of joy too. Here I am mixing together the all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, and water. And I like to give this a little bit of a stir with a Danish dough hook first just to get things going. But I have found that the best way to really get things done when it comes to making bread is to use clean hands and just get in there. So just mix this enough to get the flour combined with the water. And then I let this sit for about 30 minutes, but you can let it sit up to an hour. This process of letting the flour and water sit for about 30 minutes to an hour is called autolyse. And what this does is it allows the water to fully hydrate the flour. When I first started making sourdough bread, I thought this part I could cut corners and skip, but it turns out you actually should not do that. My bread has been better since I have started letting it autolyse a little bit longer. While that is doing its thing and hydrating, I like to go ahead and measure out my salt. So here there are 20 grams of salt that I am adding into a little dish, and then 200 grams of sourdough starter. And this is the very sourdough starter that I made just a few weeks ago. I also want to emphasize here that this is active bubbly starter. So this was fed on this particular day, I think about 8 hours in advance, and it had fully doubled and was ready to be used. So that's an important part too, is making sure your starter is fully doubled and it's not deflating. You want to use it at its peak, not after. Then I'm adding in the starter and the salt to the flour and water mixture and hand mixing it for 5 minutes. This was another part I thought I could cut corners on, but my bread has definitely turned out better when I fully mix it because this helps start activating and developing that gluten and building strength in your dough. You can see here that this dough is relatively sticky, and that is normal for this recipe. If you find that while you're mixing this, that the dough is sticking to your hands, just wet your hands a little bit with some water, and that will help prevent this sticking to your hands. But you'll also find that in time through this process, it will get a little less sticky too. So don't be alarmed if you find that your dough is a little bit sticky. Now that I'm finished mixing it for 5 minutes, I'm covering it with a towel and letting it sit for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, the stretch and fold process begins. For my recipe, this is 6 cycles of stretch and folds that consist of 4 to 6 individual stretch and folds per cycle. So in other words, that means you would do 4 to 6 stretch and folds, wait, 4 to 6 stretch and folds, wait, and so on. I'll talk more about the timing for that in just a second. So you can see here, I'm pulling the dough up and then folding it in on the center. For a long time, this was a little bit of a mystery. Like, what is this supposed to look like? What is it supposed to feel like? And why am I even doing the stretch and folds? We do stretch and folds to help build strength in the dough. We do as many stretch and folds as we need in each cycle until the dough is no longer stretching easily. So you can see here now the dough actually isn't stretching that easily anymore. It's starting to get a little bit tough for me to pull. So that is an indication that that stretch and fold cycle is over. Now, in terms of how many stretch and fold cycles to do, I do 3 cycles of stretch and folds every 15 minutes. So I stretch and fold, wait 15 minutes, stretch and fold, wait 15 minutes, stretch and fold. Then I increase that cadence to 30 minutes between cycles 3 times. So then I stretch and fold, wait 30, stretch and fold, wait 30, stretch and fold again. When I first started making sourdough, I was following the recipes and instructions to a T, which was helpful to get things started. So a great place to start is just with the basic instructions. But I found over time making sourdough that really what we have to do is pay attention to what needs to be done, which is kind of, I think, a learning lesson for life, actually, just to meet the needs of the day, because it will vary depending on the type of flour that you're using, the temperature, the humidity. So it will never really be the same. So just pay attention to when it seems tough to pull the dough, and then you are done that cycle. You'll also notice here my hands aren't that covered in dough anymore. As you continue through the stretch and fold cycles, the dough will become less sticky. If it is still sticky, that is okay. Just wet your hands again, and that should prevent it from sticking to your hands. But generally, as that gluten develops and the dough builds strength, it is just not as sticky as it was in the beginning. The integrity of the dough begins to evolve throughout this process, and you might even begin to notice some bubbles forming. You can see here there are a few bubbles that have arrived in my dough. I try not to pop them, but don't worry. If you pop some during the stretch and fold process, there are more bubbles to be made along the way. My stretch and folds are complete, 3 every 15 minutes and 3 every 30 minutes. So after that, I am just wetting a towel and wringing it out a lot so that way there's not water dripping on my dough, and covering the dough and letting it sit all day. This is also one of the advantages or benefits of making sourdough bread, because it's doing all of its work on the counter or maybe on the bread proofing function on your oven while you are doing whatever you want to do. So my bread takes about 5 to 6 hours to proof. So this is time that I make coffee and enjoy my afternoon. I get the laundry done. I do dishes. I work on my YouTube videos. I do all sorts of things while my bread is fermenting. So while I'm living my life, my dough is fermenting and creating a nutritious food for my family to eat and enjoy. Sourdough and scratch made cooking do require time, but I truly believe if it's done right, that time is on our side with recipes like this. How long to bulk ferment your dough will depend on a lot of factors. I would just keep an eye on it. For this recipe, we are looking for about double in volume, which can be a little tricky with sourdough because sourdough does sort of spread rather than rise. It is rising, but at the same time it spreads too, so it can be a little bit tricky. So we are looking for about double in size. Another thing I like to do is just poke it, and it should take about 2 seconds for where you poked it to fill back in or spring back toward you. And that is an indication that your dough is ready. But the most important thing you can do to see if your dough is proofed enough is to keep making bread, keep experimenting, and learning what works for you. After 6 hours, my dough is ready. So I've turned it out onto a clean countertop, and I'm using a bench scraper to cut it in half. Here, I do take care not to pop any bubbles if possible. Then it's time to shape the dough. So to shape, I take my left hand and swoop it from underneath the dough up and over in my right hand to spin it clockwise. So if you can see here, I'm using both of my hands to turn it. And what this does is it creates surface tension to hold the shape of the dough, because like I said, that sourdough can actually spread and lose its shape. So building tension can help prevent that. Also here, I do not have any flour on the counter, and the counter is dry. If the counter is wet or there's flour, the dough will slide too easy and you won't be able to create that tension. So in addition to moving your hands, you're also using the friction of the counter to build tension in the dough. Then I just let the shaped dough sit on the counter for another 20 to 30 minutes to develop a skin. What that does is it allows the outside of the dough to dry a little bit, which will retain moisture on the inside of the dough. When that time is up, I am just taking 2 bowls and lining them with a cloth. You might use a Banneton basket if you have one. I actually don't have any, but what I try to do to sort of mimic the usefulness of a Banneton basket is use bowls that are a little bit taller and slightly more cylindrical in shape than they are shallow. Use what you have, it will work just fine. But here I'm just taking the towel, putting it into the bowl, and then sprinkling it with a little bit of flour just to make sure that dough doesn't stick to the towel later on. And you can see here, there's some nicely formed bubbles on the top of the dough. Some people like to flick the bubbles to get them out because they don't want them in the crust. I don't mind them there. The more bubbles, the merrier. So I just let them be as they are. Then using a bench scraper underneath of the dough, I lift it up and put it into the basket face down. So the part that was touching the counter should actually be facing up inside of your towel lined basket or your Banneton basket. This is simply because so tomorrow when I turn the dough out to bake, it's already right side up. When the dough is in the basket, I am just taking the ends of the dough or the sides of the dough and pulling them together in the middle. You can see here, I'm just taking the left and right sides and pulling it together and then pinching it in the middle, and then the top and the bottom and pulling it together and pinching it in the middle. Again, this just helps with shaping and creating tension. Then I'm just taking some shopping bags and putting them right over the bowl and knotting it shut. This helps retain moisture, and then these go into the fridge for 12 to 15 hours before baking. You could definitely let yours stay in the fridge for less or more time, but what this does is it creates that sourdough flavor. So if you were to let it be in the fridge for less time, it would not be quite as sour. If you let it stay in the fridge for more time, it might be more sour, but it also stops that rising process to give you time to bake. Sourdough, if it's at 70 degrees or higher, it will continue to rise and will continue to grow until it can't anymore. And then you don't have a usable dough. That's called overproofing your dough. So this stops that, but allows the flavors to develop. It is the next day and it's time to bake. So I am taking a cast iron Dutch oven. I did a whole review about Dutch ovens that you can check out. It's linked below in the description box. But this is my Lodge Dutch oven that I'm using, and I am preheating it at 500 degrees. So once the oven hits 500 degrees, I let it sit in there for 20 more minutes just so it is nice and piping hot. And in the meantime, I am washing my new bread stencil. So this is a new product that I will be offering in my shop soon in early 2024. I designed these and coffee art stencils, and I use a laser cutter in my garage actually to make them. So they are handmade and they will be available soon. I'm also just getting some flour in a powder shaker so I can use the stencils. So while the oven's preheating, I'm just trying to get a few things done. It's time to bake, so I am laying out a sheet of parchment paper, and then I'm grabbing my lame, which is just a razor attached to a stick, if you will, for scoring the bread. They are very sharp, so I keep it up high where my little 2-year-old can't reach it. I'm just baking one at a time. So I'm grabbing my first batch of sourdough for the day and turning it out onto the parchment paper. And then I'm getting ready to use my bread stencil. So I made 3 different sizes, small, medium, and large, because I didn't know which one would actually fit. But I tested these and it looks like the medium is probably the best size. So I'm just placing that stencil right on top of the dough, and I'm using my hand to hold down the edges, and then I'm sprinkling flour over the top. This is all-purpose flour. Next time I'm going to try rice flour because I do know that rice flour maintains its color a little bit better. And then I'm just rubbing it in just to make sure that it doesn't build too high and that it doesn't wipe off after it's finished baking. So here's the first stencil. It looks really good, and I'm happy with that. So then it is time to score. Scoring is necessary. This prevents your bread from basically exploding. It will create pressure in the oven as it grows and builds. And if you don't score, it's just going to burst wherever it may at the weakest spot of the dough. So this just tells the dough essentially where to expand. And then I'm baking this at 500 degrees with the lid on the Dutch oven for 25 minutes. Baking with the lid on allows steam to build, which will help the oven spring and for your bread to rise in the oven. And then once it's done after 25 minutes, I'm taking it out, removing the lid, and I'm really excited to check out my sourdough stencil here. And so far it looks awesome. This goes back in the oven with the lid off, and I'm dropping the temperature to 475. This will then make a golden crust and it'll be a beautiful loaf of bread. In my oven, I found that I only need about 10 minutes at this point until my bread is done, but ovens do vary. So I would just check on it after 10 minutes and see if it is done. Mine is definitely done after 10 minutes. So I'm taking it out, and I could not be happier with the way the bread stencil looks on my loaf of bread. It looks beautiful. This bread, I'm not sure at this point what the inside looks like. It's a brand new starter. So from the outside, it looks great, but from the inside, we won't know until it cools. And that is really important. I know how tempting it is to slice into a nice hot loaf of bread, but letting it cool is part of the baking process. So it needs to come all the way to room temperature before slicing. I like to put it on a little cooling rack so that way it gets some nice airflow and it doesn't get sweaty on the bottom from sitting on a pan. And then it's time to bake this second loaf. Now, this recipe makes 2 sourdough loaves, or boules as they call them. You can certainly cut it in half and just make one. On this one, I'm testing a T-Rex stencil because my little girl loves dinosaurs, and this one's super cute. I do have a little bit of editing to do with it, but it turned out really adorable. Of course, there are lots of different ways of scoring and creating sourdough art, but these stencils are a way for me just to simplify without cutting any corners. I'll let you know when they're available in the shop, but it is finally time to see what the inside of this bread looks like. Because remember, this is the first time I have baked with this starter. And I have to be honest, I could not be happier with how this bread turned out. In fact, I think it might even be better than the bread I've made with my existing starter. So I prefer a denser crumb, which just means there are not as many giant holes in the bread. And so you can see here, there are some beautiful holes there, but this is still a really nice everyday loaf of bread with small enough holes that I can still put things like jelly or jam on it. It makes great toast and even sandwiches. My whole family prefers a denser crumb because it is, in our opinion, a more versatile loaf of bread. So this recipe will create a slightly denser crumb, but it is delicious. In terms of sourdough flavor, it wasn't quite as soury as I liked. My husband actually said he liked it better like that, but I do prefer a little more sourdough flavor. That will arrive as the starter matures. Remember, this is a brand new starter. I will be publishing a video soon about how to care for your starter and maintain your starter, and that sourdough flavor will begin to develop more as I continue to bake with this. But other than that, I could not be happier with this bread. I'm super excited to make starter with you. I'm even more excited to make bread with you. And stay tuned for the next video in my sourdough series, which is how to care for and maintain your starter. Thank you so much for tuning into Moon and Magnolia's YouTube channel, where we elevate the everyday from scratch and at home. And I'll see you again next time.